There's this moment I keep replaying in my head, over and over again. The sound of her laugh, the way her hand brushed against her hair, the faint smell of spring rain lingering on her coat. Nothing unusual, right? Except it was. I just didn't know it yet. I live with my wife, Karen, in a modest brick house on the outskirts of Bentonville, Arkansas. We've been together nearly 18 years, and for the most part, things have been good. Solid even. You don't stick with someone for that long without understanding them inside out, or so I thought. Our neighborhood is the kind of place where everyone waves when you drive by, where the kids' bikes are scattered across driveways, and where an old yellow Labrador named Buddy has been a permanent fixture on the block for as long as I can remember. Buddy belonged to Mr. Wrigley, our next-door neighbor, a retired postman who's lived here longer than we have. He's a kind man, but time's caught up with him. He had a stroke last year and hasn't been able to walk Buddy much since. That's where Karen stepped in. It was her idea, actually. She said we should help out, and I agreed. It was a sweet thing to do, another reminder of why I loved her. At first, I even joined her on the walks. But then work got busier, and honestly, I figured Karen could use the fresh air. She took over Buddy's walks completely, twice a day, once in the morning and again in the evening after dinner. For a while, it seemed like a win for everyone. Mr. Wrigley was grateful, Buddy was thrilled, and Karen seemed different. Lighter somehow. She said the walks helped her clear her head, especially after stressful days at the bank where she worked. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back maybe I should have. It started with little things. Karen began taking longer routes, saying Buddy needed extra exercise. Sometimes she'd come back flushed, her hair messy like she'd been running. I teased her about taking the dog jogging, and she laughed it off. Then there was the phone, always in her pocket, and always on silent. She'd glance at it during dinner, smile at something, and tuck it away before I could ask what was so funny. One night, after a late walk, she came home with mud streaks on her jeans and a story about Buddy getting loose and chasing a rabbit. It seemed plausible. Buddy's a big dog, and the woods behind our street are full of wildlife. But something about the way she told it felt off. Like she was rehearsing the lines in her head as she said them. Still, I didn't push. You don't get to 18 years of marriage by questioning every little thing. Besides, Karen wasn't the type to hide things, or at least, that's what I'd always believed. Then came the day I found the earring. It was a Sunday, and Karen had taken Buddy out while I mowed the lawn. As I was putting the mower away, I saw something glinting in the gravel driveway. I bent down and picked it up, a delicate silver stud, not Karen's style at all. She preferred bold, colorful jewelry, not something so understated. When she got back, I held it up and joked. "Lose something?" Karen froze for half a second, just long enough for me to notice. Then she smiled and said, "Oh, that's not mine. Probably one of the neighbors. I'll drop it off later." Her answer was casual, but her body wasn't. She'd gone stiff, her smile too wide, her voice just a touch too high. I didn't press her, again, because why would I? But as she walked away, I felt the first crack in the foundation of our marriage. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the earring. I should have let it go, but something about the way Karen reacted gnawed at me. She wasn't lying, at least, not outright, but she wasn't telling the whole truth either. And I needed to know why. The next morning, I did something I've never done in all our years together. I went through her phone. Karen's phone was right there on the kitchen counter, screen dark, her morning coffee cooling next to it. She'd just left for work, and I knew I had maybe 10 minutes before I'd have to head out myself. My hands were shaking as I picked it up. Now, before you judge me, let me just say this wasn't something I'd ever imagined doing. I respected Karen's privacy. I trusted her. But that little silver earring, and the way she'd stiffened, had me spinning in my own head. I told myself I wasn't snooping, I was just putting my mind at ease. Her lock screen was a picture of us from our last vacation, smiling on the shores of Lake Washita. It felt almost mocking. Of course, it was locked. I stared at it for a moment, debating whether to try guessing her passcode. I knew Karen well enough to know she'd pick something simple. Her birthday? No. Our anniversary? I tried it. Bingo. I was in. Her messages were the first thing I checked, scrolling through names I recognized. Nothing unusual popped up, but then I noticed a thread labeled Group Chat, with a bunch of her coworkers. That's where I saw something that stopped me cold. It was a picture, just Buddy, sitting in the grass by the trailhead behind our neighborhood. But it wasn't the photo itself that struck me, it was the timestamp. She'd sent it at 9:48 p.m. last Friday night. Karen had told me she'd been walking Buddy around the block that night, but the trailhead? That was a good 15-minute walk from our house, and the woods beyond stretched for miles. Why had she gone out there so late? I scrolled up, looking for more. Most of the messages were harmless, work banter, memes, photos of pets, but then I saw one from a guy named Ryan. It was short. 9:30? She'd replied with a thumbs-up emoji. Ryan wasn't a name I recognized from her office, and I knew most of her coworkers by now. Something about the exchange felt transactional. My gut twisted. I locked the phone and put it back where I found it, but my mind was racing. Maybe it was innocent. Maybe Ryan was just someone from work she was meeting for something legitimate. But why hadn't she mentioned it to me? The rest of the day, I couldn't focus. Every time I tried to convince myself it was nothing, my brain circled back to that earring, to the woods, to the way Karen had smiled too brightly when she'd brushed it off. That evening, I told Karen I'd take Buddy out for a change. She hesitated, just for a second, then said, "Sure, that'd be nice." I followed her usual route, taking the leash in one hand and my flashlight in the other. The trailhead wasn't far, and Buddy seemed to know it well, tugging me forward like he was eager to go. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the trees. When we reached the clearing near the creek, Buddy suddenly pulled hard to the left, dragging me toward a thicket of bushes. I stumbled after him, nearly dropping the leash. He started sniffing furiously at something hidden in the undergrowth. And that's when I saw it. A blanket. Old, faded, and crumpled on the ground like someone had been sitting there not long ago. Next to it was an empty coffee cup, a lid with a familiar green logo. Starbucks. I crouched down, picking up the lid. There was a name written on it in black marker. Ryan. My heart was pounding as I stared at the name, the same one from Karen's texts. My head was spinning. Was this where she'd been that night? Meeting him out here, in the woods? And if so, why? Buddy let out a low whine, tugging at the leash. I realized I'd been standing there, frozen, for who knows how long. I shoved the lid back into the bushes and turned to leave, my mind racing. When I got home, Karen was in the kitchen, her hair tied back, the smell of spaghetti sauce filling the air. She smiled when she saw me, like everything was perfectly normal. "How was the walk?" she asked. I hesitated, the words caught in my throat. "Fine," I said finally. "Buddy's a handful." She laughed, turning back to the stove. "Tell me about it." I wanted to ask her. I wanted to tell her what I'd found and demand an explanation. But something held me back, fear maybe. Fear of what her answer might be. Instead, I grabbed a beer from the fridge and sat at the table, watching her move around the kitchen like nothing was wrong. But deep down, I knew that something was. The thing about suspicion is that it eats away at you. Every smile feels forced, every word feels loaded. I sat across from Karen at dinner that night, watching her laugh and talk about her day like nothing had changed. But for me, everything was different. I kept replaying it all in my head, the earring, the texts, the coffee cup. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe I was reading too much into things. But then again, maybe I wasn't. After dinner, I told Karen I needed to catch up on some work and locked myself in the den. It wasn't work I was doing, though, it was research. I opened her Facebook account and scrolled through her friends list, looking for a Ryan. Nothing. Next, I checked Instagram. Karen didn't post much, but she followed a few dozen accounts, mostly friends and family. Still no Ryan. Finally, I went back to her messages. Her phone was on the counter again, and she was upstairs taking a shower. My heart was pounding as I unlocked it and opened the group chat. Scrolling back further, I found another exchange with Ryan. Ryan. Same spot? Karen. Yeah, after the evening walk. I'll bring it. Bring what? I kept scrolling, but the messages didn't give me much more to go on. They were short, vague, and frustratingly ordinary. There were no pictures, no confessions, nothing I could point to as definitive proof of, well, anything. But then I noticed the timestamps. All of Ryan's messages were sent around the same time, late evening, just before or after Karen's walks with Buddy. I locked the phone and put it back, my mind racing. Who was Ryan? What was Karen bringing? And why was she meeting him in the woods, of all places? The next morning, I decided to test her. Over breakfast, I casually asked, Hey, do you ever run into anyone when you're walking, Buddy? Karen looked up from her coffee, her expression neutral. Sometimes. Why? Just curious. Seems like you're gone a while some nights. She shrugged. Buddy likes to take his time. And the fresh air's nice. I nodded, pretending to accept her answer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was holding something back. That evening I told her I had to work late and wouldn't be home for dinner. She barely looked up from her book. Okay. Don't stay too late. I didn't go to work though. Instead, I parked my truck a block away from the trailhead and waited. Karen came into view just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, Buddy trotting happily beside her. She was wearing her usual walking gear, leggings, a hoodie, and her hair pulled back in a ponytail. I stayed low in the seat, watching as she disappeared into the woods. I waited a few minutes, then followed. The trail was quiet, the trees casting long shadows in the fading light. I kept my distance, staying far enough back that she wouldn't hear me. My heart was pounding so loudly, I was sure it would give me away. Finally, I saw her. She was standing in the clearing near the creek, the same spot where I'd found the blanket and the coffee lid. And she wasn't alone. A man was with her, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap. I couldn't make out his face, but I didn't need to. Karen handed him something, a small bag, maybe. He nodded, said something I couldn't hear, and then turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. Karen stood there for a moment, staring after him. Then she bent down to pet Buddy and started back toward the trailhead. I ducked behind a tree, my heart racing. What the hell had I just seen? By the time I got back to my truck, Karen was already home. She greeted me at the door, smiling like nothing had happened. How was work? She asked, leaning in for a quick kiss. Fine, I said, my voice tight. Busy. She didn't notice. Or if she did, she didn't let on. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. My mind was spinning with questions, but one thought kept rising above the rest. I needed answers. The next morning, I woke up with a plan. It wasn't a good one, but it was all I had. I wasn't ready to confront Karen, not yet. I needed more, something solid to explain what I'd seen in the woods. Karen left for work as usual, and I spent the day replaying the scene in my head. The man, the bag, the way she'd lingered as he walked away, it didn't add up. But instead of giving me clarity, it just left me with more questions. That evening, I told Karen I'd handle Buddy's walk again. She seemed surprised, but not suspicious. Sure, she said, handing me the leash. He could use a long one today. I nodded, pretending to be casual, but my chest felt tight. I wasn't planning to just walk Buddy. I was going to retrace Karen's steps from the night before. We followed the trail to the clearing near the creek. The blanket was still there, crumpled in the underbrush, but there was no sign of the man or the bag. I searched the area anyway, shining my flashlight into the bushes and along the tree line. That's when I noticed it, a small metal tin, half buried in the dirt. I picked it up and opened it, revealing a few tightly rolled joints and a lighter. Weed. My mind raced. Was this what Karen was doing? Selling weed? It seemed ridiculous. Karen wasn't the type. She worked at a bank, for God's sake. But the evidence was right there in my hands. Suddenly, a voice behind me made me jump. Hey, you lost? I spun around to see a man emerging from the trees. It wasn't the same guy I'd seen the night before, but he had the same air about him, casual, confident, and just a little too familiar with the place. No, I said quickly, slipping the tin into my pocket. Just walking the dog. He looked me up and down, then smirked. Sure you are. Buddy growled low in his throat, and the man backed off, holding up his hands. Relax, he said. Just asking. He turned and disappeared into the woods, leaving me standing there, my heart pounding. When I got home, Karen was in the living room, watching TV. She looked up when I walked in, her smile warm and easy. How was the walk? She asked. Fine, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Quiet. She nodded and turned back to the TV, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she knew something. That night, after she went to bed, I pulled out the tin and stared at it. If Karen was involved in something illegal, I needed to know. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Karen was cautious, practical, a rule follower to the core. Why would she risk everything for something like this? The next morning, I decided to take a different approach. Hey, I said casually over breakfast. I was thinking about taking Buddy for a hike this weekend. Maybe out by the creek? Karen froze for just a second, barely enough to notice, then smiled. That sounds nice, she said. He loves it out there. Her answer was easy, but her eyes betrayed her. She wasn't just surprised, she was nervous. I spent the rest of the day trying to figure out my next move. Confronting her felt premature, but keeping quiet wasn't an option anymore. I needed more than half-truths and guesses. That evening, as Karen left for her usual walk, I followed her. The sun was setting as I parked my truck a block away from the trailhead. I'd left the house a few minutes after Karen, taking a different route to avoid being seen. My hands gripped the wheel tightly as I waited, the engine ticking softly in the cooling evening air. When I finally saw her silhouette moving toward the woods, Buddy trotting happily at her side, I gave her a bit of a head start before following on foot. The woods were quiet except for the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional rustle of squirrels darting through the trees. I kept my distance, careful to stay just out of sight. Karen followed the same path as the night before, and soon we reached the clearing. She stopped, looked around, and then leaned against a tree, her phone in her hand. For a few minutes, nothing happened. I crouched low behind a cluster of bushes, my breath fogging in the cool air. Just when I started to think I might have been wrong about all of it, I heard the sound of footsteps. A man emerged from the trees, his dark jacket blending into the shadows. It was him, the same guy from before. Ryan. Karen straightened up, slipping her phone into her pocket. Buddy wagged his tail but stayed by her side, his leash wrapped loosely around her wrist. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language told a story all its own. Karen was stiff, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Ryan stood close, too close, his hands gesturing as he spoke. Whatever they were discussing, it wasn't casual. Then, Karen handed him something. A small envelope, sealed and unmarked. Ryan took it, nodded, and slid it into his pocket. That's when it hit me, this wasn't about weed. It wasn't even about money. This was something else entirely. Ryan leaned in, saying something that made Karen frown. She shook her head sharply, and for a moment, I thought she was going to walk away. But then he touched her arm, just a light touch, barely there, and she froze. It was the way she froze that gutted me. Not startled or uncomfortable, but conflicted. Like she wanted to pull away but couldn't. Before I could stop myself, I stepped out from behind the bushes. Karen! Her head snapped around, her eyes wide with shock. Ryan tensed, his hand dropping from her arm as he turned to face me. What the hell is going on? I demanded, my voice louder than I intended. Karen opened her mouth, but no words came out. She looked between me and Ryan, her face pale in the fading light. Ryan, on the other hand, was calm, too calm. Relax, he said, holding up his hands. This isn't what you think. I took a step closer, my fists clenched at my sides. Then why don't you tell me what it is? Karen finally found her voice. Eddie, please. Don't Eddie me. I snapped. I want answers, and I want them now. Ryan glanced at Karen, then back at me. Maybe we should all just take a breath, he said smoothly. Nobody's done anything wrong here. I laughed bitterly. Funny, because it sure doesn't look that way. Karen stepped between us, her hands outstretched like she was trying to stop a fight before it started. Eddie, I can explain, she said quickly. But not here. Please. Why not here? I shot back. You seemed fine doing whatever this is out here. Why not explain it now? She hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything I needed to know. Ryan took a step back, his hands still raised. Look, man, I'm gonna go. This is between you two. Damn right it is, I said, my eyes never leaving Karen. Ryan nodded once, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. Karen and I stood there in silence, the air between us heavy with everything unsaid. Finally, she sighed and looked down at the ground. Let's go home, she said quietly. I wanted to yell, to demand answers right then and there. But the weariness in her voice stopped me. Whatever this was, it wasn't simple. We walked back to the house in silence, Buddy trotting along like nothing was wrong. When we got inside, Karen turned to me, her eyes glistening with tears. Let me explain, she said. I crossed my arms, my jaw tight. I'm listening. She took a deep breath, her hands twisting nervously. It's not what you think, she began. Ryan. He's not. The words caught in her throat, and she shook her head. He's not who he seems to be. What does that even mean? I asked, my frustration boiling over. Karen's eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw something I hadn't expected, fear. Fear. That's what I saw in Karen's eyes. Not guilt, not anger, fear. It stopped me in my tracks, made me hesitate when all I wanted to do was demand answers. I took a breath, forcing my voice to stay calm. Karen, you've got to give me something here. Who is Ryan? What's going on? She looked away, her hands trembling as she reached for the back of a chair to steady herself. It's complicated, she said finally. Try me. Karen sighed, her shoulders slumping as if she were carrying the weight of the world. Ryan is a private investigator. I blinked. Of all the things I'd expected her to say, that wasn't even on the list. A private investigator? I repeated. What does that have to do with you meeting him in the woods and handing him envelopes? She hesitated again, and I could see the gears turning in her head. She was trying to decide how much to tell me, or whether to tell me anything at all. Finally, she sat down at the table, her eyes fixed on the floor. I hired him, she said softly. You hired a PI? I said, struggling to keep up. Why? Karen looked up at me, her eyes glistening with tears. Because I thought you were hiding something from me. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. You thought I was hiding something? I asked, incredulous. What the hell gave you that idea? She shook her head, wiping at her eyes. I don't know. It's just, you've been so distant lately. You're always working late, and you've been so distracted. I thought maybe there was someone else. Someone else? I repeated, the anger rising in my chest. Karen, are you serious right now? You've been sneaking around with this guy, and you thought I was the one having an affair? I know how it looks, she said quickly. But it wasn't like that. I wasn't sure, Eddie. I needed to know. I laughed bitterly, running a hand through my hair. So instead of talking to me, you decided to hire some guy to follow me around? Do you hear how crazy that sounds? Karen winced, but she didn't deny it. Did he find anything? I asked coldly. She shook her head. No. He said there was nothing. That's why I told him to stop last week. Tonight was just settling up. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and awkward. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to believe her, to let it go and move on. But another part of me, the part that had been following her into the woods and digging through her phone, wasn't ready to let this end. If that's true, I said finally, why didn't you tell me before? Why sneak around? Why the woods? Why not just meet him somewhere normal? Karen sighed, rubbing her temples. I didn't want you to find out. And he said the woods were safer. Less chance of someone seeing us and starting rumors. It made sense, in a twisted kind of way. But it still didn't sit right with me. Karen, I said, my voice softening, if you thought something was wrong between us, why didn't you just talk to me? Her eyes filled with tears again. I was scared, she admitted. Scared that if I asked, I wouldn't like the answer. The anger in my chest deflated, replaced by something else, something closer to pity. Karen had always been strong, confident. Seeing her like this, so vulnerable, was jarring. I sat down across from her, the tension between us slowly unraveling. There's nothing going on, Karen, I said gently. I swear to you, there's no one else. She nodded, her shoulders shaking as she let out a shaky breath. I believe you, she whispered. For a moment, we just sat there, the silence heavy but not unbearable. It felt like we were standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into the unknown. I wanted to believe that this was the end of it, that the worst was behind us. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. Because if Karen could think I was hiding something from her, maybe I'd missed something she was hiding from me. Karen's explanation lingered in my mind long after she went to bed. I stayed at the kitchen table, replaying the conversation over and over. Her words made sense, but something still felt off. It wasn't just the secrecy or the strange behavior, it was the fear in her eyes. That wasn't the reaction of someone who'd simply made a mistake. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her. But there was still this gnawing doubt, this voice in the back of my head whispering that I wasn't getting the whole story. The next day, I decided to test her. Hey, I said over breakfast, trying to sound casual. Since Ryan's out of the picture now, do you want me to take over Buddy's walks for a while? You've been handling it so much lately, I feel bad. Karen's reaction was subtle, but I caught it. A flicker of hesitation before she smiled. That's sweet of you, but it's fine. I like the time to myself. Are you sure? I pressed. She nodded quickly, her smile widening just a little too much. Absolutely. It's my favorite part of the day. That unease I'd felt the night before came rushing back. If everything between her and Ryan was truly over, why was she so insistent on keeping the walks? That evening, I told her I had a late meeting and wouldn't be home until after dark. It wasn't true, I just needed to see what she'd do when she thought I wasn't around. As soon as she left with Buddy, I followed her again, staying farther back this time to avoid being seen. The trail was darker than usual, the trees casting long shadows in the fading light. When we reached the clearing, Karen stopped and looked around. For a moment, it seemed like no one was coming, and I started to wonder if maybe I was wrong, maybe Ryan really was out of the picture. But then, out of the darkness, another figure emerged. It wasn't Ryan. This man was older, stockier, wearing a camouflage jacket and a hunting cap. He carried a small duffel bag slung over one shoulder, his movements slow and deliberate. Karen stepped forward, and the man handed her the bag. She opened it briefly, glanced inside, then nodded. They exchanged a few words, their voices too low for me to hear, before the man turned and disappeared into the trees. I stayed hidden, my heart pounding as Karen adjusted the bag over her shoulder and started back down the trail. When I got home, she was already in the living room, the bag nowhere in sight. "How was your meeting?" she asked, looking up from her book. "Fine," I said, forcing a smile. "How was the walk?" She shrugged. "Same as always. Quiet. Quiet. That word stuck with me as I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling. If Karen was done with Ryan, who was this new guy? And what was in the bag? The next morning, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. After Karen left for work, I tore through the house, searching for the duffel bag. It wasn't in the closet, the laundry room, or under the bed. Finally, I checked the garage. There, tucked behind a stack of old paint cans, I found it. My hands were shaking as I unzipped it, my mind racing with possibilities. Drugs? Money? Something worse? But when I opened it, I found something I hadn't expected at all. Paper. Stacks of documents, neatly arranged in manila folders. I pulled one out and flipped it open, scanning the contents. It was a legal agreement, dense with jargon, but the names jumped out at me immediately. Karen. Mr. Wrigley. I grabbed another folder. This one was filled with letters, handwritten and shaky, addressed to a Ms. Taylor. The return address was for a nursing home across town. I went through folder after folder, my confusion growing with each one. These weren't business documents or anything illegal. They were personal. Letters, agreements, even old photographs. And they all seemed to point back to Mr. Wrigley. I zipped the bag shut and sat back on my heels, my mind spinning. What the hell was Karen doing with all of this? That evening, as we sat down for dinner, I couldn't hold it in any longer. What's in the duffel bag? I asked abruptly. Karen froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. What? The bag, I said, my voice steady but firm. The one you got from that man in the woods? What's in it? Her face went pale. Eddie, I can explain. Then explain, I interrupted. She set her fork down and took a deep breath, her hands trembling. It's about Mr. Wrigley, she said finally. He's been trying to get his affairs in order. I've been helping him. Helping him? I repeated, skeptical. What does that mean? Karen hesitated, then launched into an explanation about how Mr. Wrigley had no family left, how he didn't trust lawyers or banks, and how he'd asked her to help sort through his will and personal documents. But why all the secrecy? I asked. Because he didn't want anyone to know, she said quickly. He's paranoid, Eddie. He thinks people are out to take advantage of him. It was plausible. But it still didn't explain everything. And Ryan? I pressed. What about him? Karen sighed. Ryan was just someone I hired to check on things, to make sure there wasn't anyone trying to scam him. That's all. Her words made sense, but the way she said them didn't. She was too rehearsed, too careful. I wanted to believe her. But deep down, I knew there was still more to the story. Karen's explanation sounded logical enough, but the tension in her voice gave her away. She was still holding back. I could feel it in the air between us, like an unspoken truth hanging over the table. I didn't push her that night. Instead, I decided to take a different approach. If Karen wasn't going to tell me the whole truth, I'd find it myself. The next day, I took the afternoon off work and headed to the nursing home mentioned in the letters from the duffel bag. It wasn't far, a small, quiet place tucked away in a corner of Bentonville. Inside, I found a friendly receptionist who directed me to the administrator, a no-nonsense woman named Linda. I introduced myself as a neighbor of Mr. Wrigley's and explained that I'd found some letters addressed to someone at the home. Linda's expression softened. "Ah, you must mean Miss Taylor," she said. "Who is she?" I asked. "She was Mr. Wrigley's sister," Linda said. "She lived here for the last few years of her life before she passed away last spring." I blinked. "I didn't know he had any family." Linda nodded. "Most people didn't. They were estranged for years, but toward the end they reconnected. He came by often to visit her, brought her flowers, sat with her for hours. It was sweet, really." The pieces were starting to come together, but something still didn't make sense. "Do you know if she left him anything? Like an inheritance?" Linda hesitated. "I'm not sure about that. But I do know she had a lot of regrets about their relationship. She mentioned once that she wanted to make things right for him." I thanked Linda and left, my mind spinning. It was clear that Mr. Wrigley's past was more complicated than I'd realized, but it still didn't explain Karen's involvement. That evening, I decided to confront Mr. Wrigley directly. I knocked on his door, and after a moment, he opened it, leaning heavily on his cane. His face lit up when he saw me. "Eddie! What brings you by?" I stepped inside, taking in the familiar clutter of his living room. Photos of Buddy lined the mantel, along with a few framed pictures of a young woman I assumed was his sister. "I wanted to ask you something," I said carefully. "About Karen." His smile faded. "What about her?" "I know she's been helping you with some things," I said. "And I'm not upset about it, I just want to understand what's going on." Mr. Wrigley hesitated, his eyes darting toward the kitchen. "Did Karen tell you to come here?" "No," I admitted. "She hasn't told me much of anything, actually." He sighed and shuffled over to his armchair, lowering himself into it with a groan. "I suppose you deserve to know," he said finally. "Karen's been helping me with my sister's estate." "Her estate?" I echoed. He nodded. "It's a mess. Lawyers, debts, property, it's all tangled up. And I'm not exactly in any shape to deal with it myself." That explained the documents in the duffel bag, but it didn't explain the secrecy, or the men in the woods. "Why the late-night meetings?" I pressed. "Why not just handle everything during the day?" Mr. Wrigley's face tightened. "Because some of those debts aren't exactly legitimate. Karen's been helping me track down who I owe, what I owe, and who's trying to scam me." It made sense, but it still felt like only part of the truth. "And Ryan? Who is he?" Mr. Wrigley frowned. "Ryan? The private investigator," I explained. He shook his head slowly. "I don't know any Ryan. That must have been something Karen arranged on her own." I left Mr. Wrigley's house more confused than ever. If he didn't know about Ryan, what was Karen really doing? And who was the man with the duffel bag? That night, after Karen went to bed, I went back to the duffel bag. This time, I dug deeper, searching for anything I might have missed. At the bottom of the bag, tucked beneath the folders, I found a small black notebook. It was filled with names, addresses, and dollar amounts, all written in Karen's neat handwriting. Some of the names were familiar, local businesses, neighbors, but others were complete strangers. One name, in particular, caught my eye. Ryan. Next to his name was a dollar amount, $5,000. My stomach dropped. Karen had paid him. But for what? I flipped through the notebook, my pulse racing. On the last page, I found a single line written in bold letters. "He knows." The words stared back at me from the page, a punch to the gut that left me gasping for air. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Who was he? What did he know? And why would Karen write this down? I closed the notebook and sat there in the garage, the cold concrete beneath me doing nothing to steady my nerves. My head was spinning with questions, each one more urgent than the last. I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. I needed answers, and I needed them now. Karen was still awake when I went back inside, sitting on the couch with her tablet. She looked up when I walked in, her face lighting up with a soft smile. "Hey," she said. "You're up late." I didn't respond. Instead, I held up the notebook. "What is this?" I asked, my voice sharp. Her smile faltered, her eyes flicking to the notebook and back to me. "Where did you get that?" "In the bag," I said. "The one you've been hiding in the garage." "You want to explain this to me?" Karen set the tablet aside, her expression shifting from confusion to something closer to resignation. She stood slowly, her hands clasped in front of her like she was bracing herself for a fight. "It's not what you think," she began. "Then what is it?" I demanded. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been lying to me for weeks, maybe longer." Karen hesitated, her jaw tightening. "It's complicated." "Stop saying that," I snapped. "I'm tired of hearing it's complicated. I want the truth, Karen. All of it." Right now. She took a deep breath, her shoulders sagging. Fine, she said finally. You're right. I haven't been honest with you. But it wasn't because I wanted to hurt you. Then why? Karen gestured toward the couch, and we both sat down. She took a moment to collect her thoughts, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. Mr. Wrigley wasn't the only one who needed help, she said softly. I frowned. What do you mean? She looked at me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place, fear, guilt, maybe even shame. It started with him, she explained. He asked me to help with his sister's estate, and I agreed. But when I started digging into her debts, I found something I didn't expect. What? I asked. Karen swallowed hard. She'd been scammed. Someone had taken advantage of her, sold her fake investments, stolen her money. And when I looked closer, I realized it wasn't just her. There were others. A lot of them. I stared at her, my mind struggling to keep up. So you decided to investigate? She nodded. I couldn't just let it go, Eddie. These people, these criminals, they're preying on the vulnerable. I started digging deeper, trying to figure out who they were and how they operated. And Ryan? I pressed. He was supposed to help me, Karen said. I hired him to track down leads, gather information. But he got in over his head. He started asking for more money, making excuses for why he couldn't deliver. I realized I couldn't trust him, so I cut him off. Her explanation was detailed, plausible even. But one question still burned in my mind. And the notebook? I asked, holding it up again. What does this mean? Who's he, and what does he know? Karen's face went pale, her hands clutching at the hem of her sweater. He's the reason I've been so scared, she admitted. One of the men I was investigating, he found out. He sent me a message, a warning to back off. That's why I've been so careful, why I didn't want you involved. I was trying to protect you. I sat back, my head spinning. If what she was saying was true, this wasn't just about betrayal or secrecy. This was something much bigger, something dangerous. Why didn't you tell me? I asked quietly. Karen's voice cracked as she answered. Because I didn't want you to get hurt. I thought I could handle it on my own. We sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of her confession settling over us like a heavy blanket. Part of me wanted to believe her, to trust that she'd only been trying to do the right thing. But another part of me, the part that had followed her into the woods and found the duffel bag, wasn't so sure. Karen, I said finally, my voice steady. If what you're saying is true, we need to go to the police. Her eyes widened, panic flashing across her face. No, she said quickly. We can't. Why not? Because they won't believe me, she said. I don't have enough proof. And if they start digging into this, the people involved will know. They'll come after us, Eddie. Her fear was palpable, but it only made me more determined. Then we'll find the proof, I said. Together. But I'm not letting you face this alone anymore. Karen stared at me, her eyes filling with tears. Finally, she nodded. Okay, she whispered. As I held her hand that night, a part of me hoped that we were finally on the same side. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there were still pieces of the puzzle missing, pieces Karen hadn't shown me yet. The next few days were a whirlwind. Karen and I worked together, poring over the documents in the duffel bag, trying to piece together the tangled web she'd uncovered. The deeper we went, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about Mr. Wrigley's sister. There were others, names of people Karen had never met, all connected by one thing, a network of fraudulent financial schemes targeting the elderly. It was sophisticated, almost invisible, the kind of operation that could go unnoticed for years. But Karen had noticed. You realize how dangerous this is, don't you? I asked one night as we sifted through yet another stack of papers. She nodded, her face pale in the glow of the desk lamp. That's why I didn't want to tell you. I didn't want to drag you into this. Well, I'm in it now, I said firmly. And we're going to see it through. Karen gave me a weak smile, but there was still a shadow behind her eyes, something she wasn't saying. The breakthrough came 2 nights later. We found a receipt tucked into one of the folders, a payment made to a storage facility on the edge of town. It was dated 3 months ago, around the same time Karen had started acting distant. "What's this?" I asked, holding it up. Karen frowned, taking the receipt from me. "I don't know," she admitted. "There's only one way to find out." The next day, we drove to the storage facility. The place was run down, the kind of place where nobody asked questions. The manager barely glanced at us as he handed over the key to unit number 46, his eyes glued to the tiny TV on his desk. When we opened the door, the smell of mildew hit us immediately. Inside, the unit was filled with old boxes, a few pieces of broken furniture, and a filing cabinet that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Karen and I worked in silence, digging through the boxes. Most of it was junk, yellowed newspapers, outdated appliances, but in the back corner, we found something that stopped us cold. It was a box labeled Taylor Estate. Inside, we found more documents, including a ledger with names and dollar amounts. Some of the names matched the ones in Karen's notebook. Others were new. At the bottom of the box was a sealed envelope. I opened it carefully, pulling out a letter written in shaky, handwritten script. It was from Ms. Taylor. In the letter, she described how she'd been manipulated into signing over her assets to a man she referred to only as H. She didn't know his full name, but she described him in detail, a tall man with a deep voice and a scar on his left hand. Karen's face went white as she read the description. "Eddie," she whispered. "I've seen him." "Where?" She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the door. "In the woods. He was with Ryan." My blood ran cold. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't know who he was," Karen said quickly. "I thought he was just another middleman. But if he's the one running all of this..." Her voice trailed off, and I could see the fear creeping back into her expression. "We need to go to the police," I said firmly. Karen nodded, but I could tell she was still reluctant. "Okay," she said. "But let's make sure we have everything first. We can't afford to leave anything behind." That night, as we packed up the documents, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside the windows set me on edge. Karen must have felt it too, because she stayed close to me, her eyes darting toward the door every few minutes. By the time we finished, it was nearly midnight. We locked the documents in the trunk of my truck and headed back inside, too tired to say much. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, one question kept running through my mind. If Karen had seen this man before, how long had he been watching us? The next morning, everything came to a head. I woke to the sound of glass shattering downstairs. I bolted out of bed, grabbing the baseball bat I kept in the closet. Karen was right behind me, clutching her phone as she whispered, "I'm calling 911." When I reached the living room, I found the front window smashed and the documents we'd left on the coffee table scattered across the floor. The duffel bag was gone. "Karen!" I yelled. She ran in, her face pale as she took in the scene. "Oh my God!" she whispered. The police arrived within minutes, but by then, whoever had broken in was long gone. As we gave our statements, I couldn't help but feel a sickening sense of déjà vu. This was exactly what Karen had been afraid of, exactly what she'd been trying to avoid. When the officer asked if we had any idea who might have done this, I looked at Karen, waiting for her to answer. She hesitated, then shook her head. "No," she said softly. "I don't know." Her words were a lie, and we both knew it. That night, as we sat in the wreckage of our living room, I turned to Karen and asked the question I'd been avoiding for weeks. "Are you sure you've told me everything?" Karen looked at me, her eyes filled with tears. For a moment, I thought she might finally come clean. But then she looked away, and I knew I'd never get the full truth. Did I do the right thing by staying and helping her, or should I have walked away when the lies started piling up?